Good evening, everyone, and welcome to November's edition of Finding the Source. My name is Ashley Lusky, and I am the Assistant Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Unfortunately, I am once again flying solo tonight as my colleague and co-host, Pete Carmichael, is feeling under the weather this evening. He has whatever plague is going around CWI that apparently has taken down 3/4 of us. In fact, Jill, you're the only last woman standing who has not gotten the cold.
I am very glad we are not in the same room at the moment.
I know, it's very, very convenient. I credit your strong constitution to the large amounts of cake that have been forced upon you recently from your book party and Josiah's birthday. So I think there's something to it, that sugar is good for good health.
Good for the immune system, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So though I am alone without Pete tonight, I'm obviously in good company with my colleague and friend Jill Ogline Titus, who is the Associate Director of the Civil War Institute. And I should mention that Jill wears a number of hats at the CWI. She is obviously very much involved with the day-to-day goings-on of CWI, with our conference that we run every year. She is the director of the college's public history program, which is a fair amount of work. She also is kind of the one who spearheads our summer Pohanka internship program, which sends about 30 or so Gettysburg College students all across America to various national park sites, museums, different preservation organizations to participate in summer internships to help bolster their hands-on experience with public history. Jill also teaches in the public history department and also does classes for the history department as well. She teaches Intro to Public History. She teaches a couple of first-year seminars, and her specialty is civil rights, 20th century civil rights, and especially the modern Black freedom struggle. So she teaches a wide variety of courses as well. So she is very active, wears a number of hats. And she also has a lot of experience with public history, doing hands-on history herself. She is a veteran of the National Park Service. She has worked in other public history jobs before coming to CWI. So it's great to work with a fellow scholar as well as a fellow practicing public historian at the CWI. As I said, most of her scholarship does focus on the 20th century and on the civil rights movement. Her first book, which came out in 2014, is that right?
2012.
2012, I'm sorry. 2012 was called Brown's Battleground, Student Segregationists and the Struggle for Justice in Prince Edward County, Virginia. But most recently, in fact, Jill, is it officially out in print now, or are we still waiting for that final few days?
It's officially out, but it
All right. Hello again, everyone. Sorry so much for that horrible interruption to our live stream. For some reason, Facebook wasn't syncing with the StreamYard application we were using, so we had to cut off and restart again. So apologies, but we will try and pick back up where we left off at the last part of our, 3 minutes and 12 seconds that was recorded. So I believe, Jill, we are just getting into the good part. We are getting into your actual book that we will be talking about tonight.
and not cake.
Yes, Gettysburg, 1963, Civil Rights, Cold War Politics, and Historical Memory in America's Most Famous Small Town. And one of the things that we talked about, which got cut off, was that this book is literally hot off the press. It is, it's officially out, but just hasn't completely shipped yet. It's next week, you said, Jill, that it's supposed
Actually, it seems it is shipping this week. So I think it's available.
Perfect. So hot off the press. And after this conversation, I'm sure you all will be rushing to the UNC Press website to get your personal copy of Gettysburg 1963. We were also talking about how at Jill's book party a couple of weeks ago, last week, the time just kind of melds together these days, Jill explained very humbly that she wrote this book out of self-defense to justify her worth as working at the CWI as a scholar of civil rights and not the Civil War. Although she does lead battlefield tours and take her classes out there, she's not necessarily a scholar of the Civil War. But we, of course, know that not only does Jill not have to prove her worth, but that there is a lot more behind the backstory of what went into this book and its genesis. So Jill, I'm wondering if you can get us started by explaining to us what drew you to this topic to write about Gettysburg 1963, and also why haven't we read that much about this topic? Why hasn't there been a book-length study of the Centennial at Gettysburg and all of the different political and cultural undercurrents of that until this time in 2021?
Sure. And really what drew me to this topic was the convergence of my own academic interests with the landscape around me and the place where I found myself teaching and working. When we first moved to Gettysburg, we were living on Seminary Ridge, and I would walk in the evenings along West Confederate Avenue, where the Confederate state monuments have such a commanding presence. Mm-hmm. And most of those monuments were erected in the 1960s or 70s. And as I explored that area of the battlefield and began to look really closely at the inscriptions on these monuments and the symbolism, it raised a lot of questions for me because the language was clearly very mid-20th century in origin and focus. And it was clear to me that particularly some of the the South Carolina monument, which has a big line about the sacred defense of states' rights and men of honor fighting the sacred defense for states' rights. It became very clear to me that that definition of states' rights was based more in a 1963 interpretation of that phrase than an 1863 interpretation. And so I began to go to the Park Archives and to the back issues of the Gettysburg Times and other sources to find out more information about these monuments. And the more I learned, the more convinced I became that these monuments provided a really important window into understanding how the legacy and memory of the Battle of Gettysburg was used for a variety of present day purposes and at 100. And five of the Confederate monuments along West Confederate were dedicated during the Civil War Centennial between 1961 and 1965, which we all know is a very tumultuous period in American history in which race and the Cold War were front and center. And I became extremely curious about what the larger story was about how Gettysburg functioned as a prism for connecting past to present in that era, and how people began to fashion, usable pasts out of the history of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address that would help them promote certain courses of action in the present. Because it was very clear to me that there were multiple interpretations, that many of those interpretations were at odds with each other, and that understanding the dimensions of Civil War memory at 100 during the Centennial would require a deep dive into both the history of Gettysburg in the 1960s and the broader story of the sort of the national questions and conundrums that Americans were wrestling with in that period. And to answer your question about why we haven't seen more on this, there's not a lot of writing about the Civil War Centennial as a whole. There's certainly a body of scholarship, and it's really interesting and solid and exciting. It's all relatively recent. Most of it dates from the last 20 years or so. And a lot of that scholarship has focused on the activities of the Federal Commission appointed to manage the commemoration, the U.S. Civil War Centennial Commission. The Federal Commission had very little role in the Gettysburg commemoration. It was carried out almost exclusively by a state body and a variety of different local organizations. So I think that simply the fact that the Gettysburg commemoration cannot be found in the records of the National Commission has helped to ensure that has not been a lot of focus on it. Secondly, Many scholars have argued that the Civil War Centennial had basically petered out by 1962. That, it got off to this grand start and there was lots of spectacle and pageantry and some real public relations disasters, and that by 1962 people had basically lost interest. So, Gettysburg is at least the actual 100th anniversary year is 1963. So I think again that has its timing has played a role in why that story hasn't been better known. I think some of the records that I was able to use were not records that were necessarily, some of them were not necessarily records that were known to people outside of Adams County. Right. But ultimately, I think it's incredibly important that we understand Gettysburg's place in that anniversary, both on a symbolic level as an icon of American ideals and as a landscape that was truly, for most Americans during the 1960s, the mecca of the American Civil War, the place that you went to understand the Civil War and to engage with that part of the nation's past. Because Gettysburg has always been so clearly linked with the ideals of the Gettysburg Address, it's always, I think, been connected to larger questions of the meaning and significance of the war itself. So to not have Gettysburg play a major role in our understanding of the 100th anniversary, I think has been it's been a hole. And I hope that this book is not the be all and end all of that at all. There are many stories still to be told about Gettysburg during the centennial, but I hope that this is a beginning of that conversation.
Sure. Yeah, and one of the phrases that you used as kind of an anchor phrase throughout the book, which I loved, was that Gettysburg was an idea, a landscape, and a living community, which I think so nicely encompasses the complexity of your scholarship. Could you unpack that? You've told us about the kind of the idea aspect of people having competing notions of what the battle meant in the past, and then of course we'll get into what the battle can teach us about America in the present and the future as people saw it of America in the 1960s. And you've talked about the landscape, but the living community is such an important part of your story. Can you kind of unpack that part as well within the context of the other two?
Yes. I mean, Gettysburg in the 1960s was a thriving small town, very dependent on tourism, but agriculture was still the primary employer in the county. More broadly, this was a community that from its early years has always had an African-American population. In the 1960s, that population was proportionally smaller than it had been in 1863, but still vibrant. And the community was a place where the Civil War was ever present in a lot of different ways, in the very basic ways, in terms of many residents' livings had, their economic livelihood, their stability had something to do with the interpretation of the battle. Debates over land use and preservation and economic development. They were prevalent in the 1960s, just as they're prevalent in Gettysburg today. It was a community that was very much of a border state community. Gettysburg is what, 10 miles from the Mason-Dixon line. And in the 1960s, it was a place where racial segregation was still quite widespread. Not as overtly as it had been, even 10 years earlier, even in the 1950s. Yet in the 1960s, the school system was integrated on paper, but that didn't mean that the experiences of white and black students in that school system, were rooted in true equality. discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing were widespread. There were still battles over access to public accommodations for African Americans. The community was a place where local people wrestled with the same kind of questions that, Americans across the country did. But for them, the backdrop of living in this place that was so deeply connected to, ideals of freedom and democracy kind of magnified the scale of all of the debates that took place locally. So I think it's really important that we understand, Gettysburg is a real place where, tourists would go out and marvel over the landscape on Culp's Hill and think about the fierce fighting. And children would go out and ride their sleds, down the hill, knowing exactly where to turn to get like maximum leverage. And the Park Service would close certain roads in the winter so that the children could sled on them. And, and Black residents of this community had deeply rooted traditions of commemorating USCT soldiers in Lincoln Cemetery each year, and learning in their high school history classes about the significance of Gettysburg, and yet wondering, where's my place in this story? Where are the heroes that my community has taught me to honor in this broader narrative of Gettysburg and the Civil War? So I think that idea of Gettysburg being a real place where people actually lived and people were, experiencing all of the same kind of upheavals and tension and stress, and concern about nuclear weapons and concern about the place of prayer in the public schools, which of course is a major issue in the early 1960s. People in Gettysburg were experiencing and wrestling and dealing with all of those sorts of things. And they were doing it at the same time, while living in this shrine and trying to figure out what that meant for their day-to-day lives.
Right. And when the spotlight is cast on your particular town that espouses itself as being, the champion of where all of these things were realized, obviously that reveals a lot of holes, which we'll get into in a little bit. Kind of transitioning from that also brings up the point of, when the Centennial occurs in Gettysburg, there are some real pragmatic issues. There are economic needs of local residents, of businesses, of just, everyone who's involved in the commemoration itself. There are local politics at play as well as the national politics. So can you kind of walk us through, and I know that there are so many details that go into this, but kind of the big highlights of what was the planning like for the events that were to take place in Gettysburg in 1963? Who were kind of the big stakeholders? What were the big conversations that were happening? And then some of the logistical aspects too, that these planners had to keep in mind as they're planning this huge event.
Yeah, the first group to really take ownership of the Centennial and actively, form themselves and get started on planning was a local group, the Adams County Civil War Centennial Commission. And they were often running by 1960 at a time that the state was still really unclear about what it was doing. The Gettysburg Centennial Commission, which was the state level commission, had technically been established in the late 1950s, but it took them quite a while to get their feet under themselves and be able to make any real progress in terms of actually planning. Interestingly, that commission was solely focused on Gettysburg. It was not a Pennsylvania Civil War Centennial Commission as many other states had. Their role was not to deal with anything else relating to the state's role in the Civil War. It was simply to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the battle and the Gettysburg Address, which I think tells you something about how at least the state officials and state legislators thought about Pennsylvania's role in the Civil War. Like, it was all about Gettysburg. Of course, in reality, it was not. But the Adams County people, from the very beginning, they said, they'll figure it out. The state commission will figure it out. They'll do something to commemorate the battle and all of the men who fought here. What we're going to do is focus on the local people, the Adams County residents. We want to tell the stories of Adams County residents from 1861 to 1865 and their experiences in the war. Certainly, we want to talk about Adams County men who fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, but we want to talk about Adams County men who fought elsewhere. We want to talk about what it was like to be a civilian experiencing the Battle of Gettysburg. Not to the extent that 150th commemorations looked at civilians, but there was some emphasis on that on part of the local community, and they were very interested in sort of popular theatrics and grassroots commemoration. They wanted to get as many people involved as possible, and they did that by doing a lot of really large-scale pageants that would have like hundreds of townspeople playing roles, oftentimes individuals playing their own ancestors, which I think really, again, emphasized the way that past and present were quite linked in a community that demographically hadn't necessarily changed all that much since 1863. A lot of the same families were still here.
And a lot of them are still here today.
Exactly. So they did a lot of participatory pageantry. They started off the Centennial with a big pageant on the town square in April of 1961, commemorating when the first Adams County soldiers went off to war. And, it was early on. They hadn't quite figured things out yet. They had some issues with the cannons, and like windows all across the square broke, shattered. And even within like 2 or 3 blocks of the square, there were all these shattered windows. But they got a handle on it. But they did a lot of activities like that, and they were very involved during the battle anniversary summer in creating a series of historical vignettes that were staged across the battlefield and ran repeatedly throughout the 3 days of the commemoration. And these were vignettes that were short theater pieces under the direction of a local woman, Betty Gifford. They were largely acted in and stage managed and costume designed and all of these sorts of things by local people. And for many visitors, they were the highlight of the Centennial. They liked these local theater productions far more than any program the Park Service did or anything that the state level commission did. So these local people were really the backbone of the commemoration, because I think it's important to emphasize that the Civil War Centennial in Gettysburg was not just 1963. There were activities from 1961 through 1964. There wasn't a lot in 1965, but there was some. And those people, day in and day out, they were there. And they were from a very wide cross section of the local community, drawing really heavily on people who were active in civic organizations, but a wide cross section of individuals. In terms of the state commission, that was they were a series of politicians, military officials, other individuals who carried a certain weight on a state level. It was not a commission made up of historians, but it was a group of people who cared very deeply about Gettysburg's reputation on a national level and very much on an international level. And they wanted a commemoration that would be both dignified and popular. They wanted people to care. They wanted people to be engaged. They wanted people to come. They didn't want to be a national embarrassment, like the events in Charleston in 1961 or the ill-fated reenactment of the First Battle of Manassas in 1961. They wanted to avoid those sorts of missteps, and yet at the same time, they were very enthusiastic about things like those theater performances, like a symbolic reenactment of Pickett's charge that would involve lots of dramatic music and smoke effects and light effects and soldiers marching across the Emmitsburg Road and coming up to the stone wall and, clasping hands and things in front of thousands and thousands of spectators. So they cared a lot about pageantry, but they were very focused on the idea of using the narrative of Gettysburg to cement America's place in the world and to cement that sort of superpower image of the United States, to emphasize that this was a nation divided. It was a nation that had come back together, was stronger than ever, was economically more powerful, was, militarily more powerful, and was made up of individuals who, just like the soldiers at Gettysburg, were willing to give all for their country and were willing to, pay any price or bear any burden to ensure the freedom of, the human freedom, and to fight back totalitarianism and to stand against communism. So they were very committed to sort of an explicitly Cold War use of the battle narrative. And I think you asked about, some of the practicalities. I mean, staging an event of that magnitude was very complicated. And the state commission, from the very beginning, they went to the Adams County Commission, to local people, to ask for help, and then they were very clear about, this is what we'll do. This is what we need you to do. We need you to have volunteers, to be, to have tents for direction and orientation, all up and down Baltimore Street. We need you to organize the American Red Cross field tents for, visitors who might get heat stroke or might have medical emergencies. We need you to figure out what you're going to do in the emergency room at your hospital to make sure that there's enough space for people who might, as anniversary visitors who might need emergency facilities. The Water Commission actually went out and tapped an artesian well out in the Colt Park development that hadn't been used in, 50 years or something, because they were so worried about the water supply. Some of the conversations were just, incredibly practical. Where are these people going to park? What about the cows who usually, graze in that field that's now going to be turned into a parking lot? What are we going to do about them?
Sure.
Are we going to have enough water? Is the sanitation department going to have enough people to inspect all of the temporary facilities? So some of it was very, very practical.
Yeah.
Then there were the more lofty things, like how do we embody these ideals and really send this message of American national greatness.
Sure. Yeah, I have to say, when I was reading through some of the details of the logistics, I had a flashback to my Richmond sesquicentennial days when we were planning all of these events for special events over 4 years. And I got a little twitch to think about all of the little details in those planning meetings that, they were so complicated. And this wasn't anything like a Gettysburg 1963 commemoration, but it's certainly overwhelming, to say the least, all of the partners. And of course, the more people you bring in, the more narratives you have to accommodate, and people have their own methodologies that they want to apply. People have their own ways to make the past usable. So let's talk about that aspect, about the people who, we have the logistics covered, the bathrooms, the water, the medical side, but then we want to make Gettysburg a usable past. So how was Gettysburg usable? What are kind of the big 3 or 4 interpretive narratives that you've identified here as kind of guiding the different directions that the commemoration would take? And then we can get a little bit more into exactly how they unfolded in specific ways in just a bit. But what were kind of the contested narratives that were being brought out?
Yeah, I see there being 3 main ones, and they're all fundamentally about connecting the battle to contemporary struggles to really both define and defend America's place in the world and the future of Black citizenship in the United States. So I see the 3 main narratives as, one, a states' rights neo-Confederate interpretation of the Confederate cause that overtly linked it to mid 20th century massive resistance and obstruction, particularly obstruction of federal attempts to enforce civil rights law or pass new civil rights laws. Then there was really an emancipationist interpretation that argued that the meaning of the Civil War was Black freedom and a new birth of freedom, and in language that we have used much more during the sesquicentennial than was used during the centennial. But even at that anniversary, there were those who argued that the best way to commemorate the Civil War and honor Civil War soldiers was to achieve equality in the present. And then there was the more, both of those interpretations were profoundly shaped by the Cold War. So I don't want to say, the third was the Cold War interpretation, because they're all really Cold War interpretations. They're all shaped by the Cold War. But that third one was the official purpose that the Gettysburg Centennial Commission embraced, and really the same purpose that the Federal Civil War Centennial Commission embraced, to boost national unity, to enhance patriotism, to encourage Americans to take pride in their heritage, to see all of the commonalities that they held, and to send a message around the world that the United States was a military power and was a bedrock of democracy, and that this nation had been through a terrible war and come out as the strongest country in the history of the world. And that American national values and American military prowess and American technology would be the saving of the globe.
Sure. Right. And let's, I think some people might be wondering how exactly the Cold War politics are so infused in that emancipationist view, for instance, of the war. Could you unpack for us a little bit how the Cold War narrative intersected with the civil rights narrative in particular instances that they both kind of reinforced each other, or they could even challenge each other depending on who was using them and for what purposes?
Yes. I mean, there's been a long history in the United States of using red baiting as a as a club to beat back progressive ideas, and particularly to impose limits on what would be an appropriate demand for reform. So Black progressives throughout the 20th century, always faced charges of being a communist if they raised questions about economic inequality, if they advocated for voting rights, if they spoke out against colonialism. The idea being a radical, being a red, was always used to discredit those progressive ideals, to the point that in the late 1940s, even the NAACP itself sort of went on the offensive against its own members, who they felt were too far leftist, were tied with radical groups, were tied, had communist taint, purging them from the organization. So segregationists like George Wallace had no problem arguing that civil rights was communist inspired, that African Americans were content, and it was only sort of Soviet or Chinese radicals who stirred them up and encouraged them to rise up and to demand rights that would result in too much power to the state. So their argument was, particularly any sort of civil rights reform that required federal enforcement of the law, that was centralization, that was giving too much power to the state, that was in a violation of federalism, and that would send the United States, on the path that the Soviet Union had followed. And in so doing, they argued that Confederates were the sort of the original anti-communists, that Confederate value, that the Confederacy's focus on states' rights and traditional race relations made Confederates a model for mid-20th century Americans to, committed to individual liberties and looking to uphold their own freedoms. So that's sort of the one side of the Cold War equation. There were many Black activists who were destroyed by charges of communism. There were many progressive, interracial, or Black civil rights organizations whose work was undercut and destroyed because their members were charged with communism. But on the other side, this is also a period in which colonialism is breaking down around the world. You had new nations emerging in Asia and Africa and Latin America at a tremendous rate. The membership of the United Nations was growing exponentially. And as these new nations emerged, their governments tended to be largely people of color. And for the US government, locked in this Cold War battle with the Soviet Union, trying to win the minds and hearts of the rest of the world, race and race relations and racial equality became a central point in this debate as members of members of these new nations and their governments, looked at both the Soviet Union and the United States to see how their rhetoric matched with their practices, to see how people of color were treated, in those nations. People of color around the world were very aware of American racial abuses in this era. And sometimes experienced them personally. I mean, emissaries, dignitaries from these new nations were often met in Washington, D.C. with, whites only signs, refusals to rent embassy space, refusals to be seated in a restaurant. I mean, this was such an issue that the State Department had to create a special office to handle the thorny political issues of diplomatic emissaries who were facing racial discrimination in the United States. So Americans were well aware that every racial crisis, particularly ones, that got headlines around the world, ones that were accompanied by dramatic images like Birmingham, children being beaten in the streets, police dogs attacking protesters, fire hoses, Little Rock, any of these major crises, that those resonated very poorly around the world, resulted in a lot of outcry from governments in Asia and Africa and Latin America, sometimes to the point of threatening to break diplomatic ties with the United States. And this was particularly critical in Africa because in the early 60s, the US government relied on the African continent as its main source of uranium, which was necessary for nuclear bombs. So we're talking about the US edge in the arms race potentially being jeopardized by continuing racial discrimination in the US. So that one could also make the argument that racial equality and ensuring the basic protections of citizenship to all Americans was not just morally the right thing to do, but it was the right thing to do from a foreign policy and a national security viewpoint.
Right. And I know that evolution of trying to move from one to the other of, we need to accept racial equality and civil rights in the country here, basically just to reinforce America's role in foreign policy and reinforce that America is a global superpower. John F. Kennedy is the perfect example of that you use, of his transition to, no, it's a moral necessity that we need to accept it, free of any thought about foreign policy and America's place in the world, that this has to happen now because the atrocities are too much. And those presidential visits that you talk about, visits, or even just having someone like former President Eisenhower having a residence in Gettysburg and being around the area, and how he used the Civil War to promote certain narratives about self-government and self-determination, but kind of avoiding the civil rights issue. And then JFK coming or not coming, as the case was during the actual commemoration. And then Lyndon Johnson coming and giving his Gettysburg address, and then returning again afterwards. That has a huge impact on how these politicians are trying to use Gettysburg to promote these various agendas. And you see those agendas evolving according to their speeches that they give, which you do such a nice job of outlining all of that in your scholarship. In terms of the evolution of the landscape during this time period and how that intersects with these contested ideas, you mentioned the South Carolina monument, some of the inscriptions there. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the other monuments that were put up during this period, and how their dedication speeches and their inscriptions also spoke to these various takes on Cold War narrative, civil rights as a moral issue versus civil rights as a necessity for foreign policy? And I know that wasn't just an issue when dedicating or rededicating Confederate monuments, but also with some of the northern monuments, like the New Jersey monument too. Could you talk to us more about the commemorative landscape transforming?
Yes. The rededication of the New Jersey monument and the activities that took place at the Eternal Peace Light monument are in terms of the landscape, I think the places where the emancipationist narrative was most explicitly embraced. The ceremonies at the Peace Light took place. There were two ceremonies there. There was a field mass on June 30th, the night before the commemoration ultimately began, and then there was a big kickoff ceremony on July 1st at the Peace Light. And it's very, very interesting because historically the Peace Light had been such a reconciliationist space. It had been a monument not to the men who fought at Gettysburg or the causes for which they fought, but a monument to the idea of no more fighting, a monument to the idea of ending war. And in large part, doing so by excising conversations about the causation of the war, the consequences of the war, and a reconciliation that was largely between whites and very much left African Americans out of the story, and abandoned the idea that the legacy of the Civil War was in any way connected to racial justice. But during the Centennial, the Peace Light was somewhat reinvented or reclaimed for emancipationist purposes. The speaker at the Peace Light on June 30th was the president of Notre Dame, and he was there because there was a rededication of a monument to Father Corby, who had also been a president of Notre Dame. And the current president, Father Ted Hesburgh, was a member of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And he used the opportunity of speaking at Gettysburg in front of the Peace Light to explicitly tell people, take something more away from Gettysburg than kepis and family pictures. Take a commitment to that new birth of freedom that Lincoln talked about. Be great emancipators in your own community. Go home and deal with discrimination in employment. Deal with discrimination in voting. Deal with, housing segregation. Deal with it because Lincoln called us here to do far more than we have done. And if we want to honor the men who died here, this is how we do it. it was it was a full-throated really good call for justice and an argument that the dead of Gettysburg would have died in vain if this new birth of freedom wasn't secured. Yeah. So that's a very different message than what was seen at many of the Confederate monument dedications. I mentioned South Carolina earlier. I think it's the most high profile example. That monument was dedicated on July 2nd, 1963. The primary dedication speaker was George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who had just a few weeks earlier been standing in the schoolhouse door in Tuscaloosa trying to block desegregation of the University of Alabama. And his message at Gettysburg was essentially states' rights, traditional racial mores, segregation. The federal government has no right to require white Southerners to do or not do anything that they don't want to do, essentially, and that any federal civil rights legislation is just a step towards state control and communism. And he gave that message in a way that was not as explicitly and overtly racialized as he tended to speak at home. He spoke in Gettysburg more in the language of destructive centralization and state control and individual rights and individual liberties. And, that was language that he then used on the presidential campaign trail for the next several years over his multiple runs for the presidency. And he was very popular with both Northerners and Southerners at Gettysburg. That message certainly resonated far beyond just the, those who might have felt innate connections to the lost cause. It's an example of how that usable past was crafted and directed toward a certain goal in the present. Then there was the dedication at the Florida Monument, which is one of my favorites. I love the Florida Monument. It's so interesting. But you don't get any of the story just by looking at it. The Florida Monument, it looks like a traditional 1960s monument. It was dedicated just one day after the South Carolina one, but the thrust of the ceremony was very different. And the dedication speaker, who was a South Florida congressman, took the opportunity to essentially argue that the dead of Gettysburg would have died in vain if Americans lost the Cold War and if communism proved triumphant across the globe. And he said communism will win if we make it seem that democracy is only for the white man. If we continue to hold to these outmoded these outmoded practices and deny Black equality and Black citizenship, we will lose the war that we're fighting now, and these men will have died in vain. Well, that's a pretty interesting thing to say at a Confederate monument dedication in Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1963. Now, I don't mean to say that this man embraced all of the goals of the Black freedom struggle. He did not. In fact, he voted against the Civil Rights Act, just not long after speaking at that dedication. But his argument was very much that foreign policy argument of we need to change our overt practices, the things that get negative publicity on the front pages of newspapers around the world. We need to do it now, but we need to do it in a very measured and, determined way and not go beyond certain limits. And we need to do it because of the foreign policy implications. So and then you have Lyndon Johnson, like you said, who essentially used the National Cemetery in May of 1963 to respond directly to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which he had just released that month. He used the National Cemetery here at Gettysburg to make his first real speech on civil rights and to respond to King's charge that there was no more time to wait, that Black Americans could not be told one more time to just wait and justice will come, that things had to change now. And Johnson, as a member of the Kennedy administration, which for years had been telling Black activists, well, please just wait a little longer, get cool off, give us time, we'll work slowly. Johnson stands at the speaker's rostrum in the National Cemetery, and he looks out at those men, and he also says, there's no more time to wait. American democracy is looks like a farce. We're embarrassed in the eyes of the world, and we've betrayed our own noblest ideals. And these men will have died in vain if we don't do something about it.
Right. And treading that fine line between these speakers don't want to necessarily alienate the crowd that's there. They know that all eyes are on Gettysburg. There, as you point out in your book, are constant fears and that the police are, ready on standby at any time in case there's a protest or in case there's, a counter protest. And so the ways of talking around subjects very creatively and craftily, where people obviously knew what they were talking about, but not in a way that would have aroused the protest or the violent resistance, is so fascinating in these constant conversations and debates that are going on between these monuments and their dedications and inscriptions. And I think a lot of people to this day, now that more people are focused on monuments, look at some of these inscriptions like the Mississippi Monument, and the fact that the Park Service allowed an inscription to be carved into that monument defining the cause of Mississippi and the Confederacy as righteous. And you talk about that in your book. How is it that so many of these inscriptions kind of slipped past the Park Service and made it onto stone in perpetuity, when in the early 20th century, there were outrages about what could be put on a monument? It could be, Confederate monuments couldn't have the Confederate battle flag. They couldn't have an inscription that was incendiary. The notion from the Park Service that you can't have censure or praise on monuments. And even on, the northern side of monuments, like the first Minnesota monument being too aggressive and changing the iconography to be a little bit softer. How was it that these monuments managed to slip by and get this iconography and these inscriptions?
Well, I mean, the two flip answers I would give you would be, first, the veterans are gone.
Yeah.
The Union veterans they're not there to have that moral standing to say, no, absolutely no, like they did to some of the earlier monuments that had to pull back. And secondly, you have to look at who's in power in Congress in this era. Southern Democrats had a stranglehold on committee leadership in Congress in this era, in large part because so few residents of their states were able to vote. Southern Democratic congressmen had far more seniority in Congress than anybody else because they stayed in office so long, because such tiny percentages of their constituents were able to vote.
Right.
There's clear evidence, at least to me. It's not clear evidence, but it certainly, I think, points to the conclusion that frequently there was a pressure applied in Washington on the level of the NPS director's office to get some of these inscriptions and designs approved. Also, there were instances in which the monument committees acted in ways that made it difficult for the NPS to do its full vetting process. Like the first of the Centennial era Confederate state monuments was Georgia. And the process was supposed to be, multi-step. Like you were supposed to get permission specifically for the site. Then you were supposed to get permission for the design. Then you were supposed to get permission for the inscription. And that was supposed to be 3 different things. But the Georgia Commission, they basically presented the NPS with this is what we've got. This is what we're doing. It's pretty much already gone to the inscriber is basically already working on it. So what are you going to do now? And they very craftily, I think, invited President Eisenhower and the General Grant, who was at that time the head of the Civil War Centennial Commission, to the dedication ceremony before they even got permission from the NPS to have the monument there.
Right.
So
they shoehorned it in.
Then with South Carolina and Florida, there are letters from influential Southern congressmen from those states, Strom Thurmond, Nolan, Johnson, to the director saying, can you please expedite this process? It's my understanding that this design and these inscriptions should be no problem at all. I will call you later to discuss. So it's not in the records, but it seems to me that it's pretty clear that pressure was applied. And there were multiple cases in the documentation in which a Park Service official would say, but what about the no praise, no blame policy? This seems to violate it. Or they would say, well, I don't really like this myself. I think it's too, overt, or like, I don't think that they can say that they fought for the defense of their country because they were rebelling against their country. But in the end, those NPS complaints were generally they were either pushed aside, or the person saying, I have a problem with this, would say, well, I don't like it, but I guess we ought to go ahead and just approve it.
Right.
Regardless.
Right. Yeah, I found it interesting too when you're talking about the iconography being disputed by Harry Fons and others about that doesn't look like a real Civil War soldier. He's too built. He's too buff. The body isn't the right type. The head is too small. The body is too big. So even it went down to that kind of level in terms of the inaccuracy of the visual iconography that people were questioning, which is fascinating as well. When we look at Gettysburg today, and people stare across the field from the angle and they see, of course, General Lee atop Trafalgar at the Virginia Memorial, or you drive along West Confederate Ave and you have these mammoth sculptures and statues to Confederate regiments and to Confederate states and the men who fought there. Some people would say, who won the battle, right? In terms of who has the most domineering monuments, the most artistically created monuments. Obviously, there's nothing quite like the Pennsylvania Memorial on the Confederate side. But we've heard that especially a lot recently, where people wonder, is this a park that's more dedicated to Southern sympathy than it is to preserving a battlefield that helped to save the Union and helped to contribute to emancipation? But your book reveals the complexities of the Centennial, what finally came out of all of this, both the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the battle, and then of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which had a more solemn, more cerebral approach to how it was commemorated. I mean, so much of the 1963, July 1963 commemoration was commercial and was pageantry and parades and the campfire programs. But when talking about the anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which kind of got short shrift in the planning process, as you know, and very little funding, that seemed to be the much bigger takeaway for this emancipationist narrative. So when you combine those two things, kind of the mixed messaging that comes out of the July 1963 dedications and the monuments and the pageantry and commercialism, and then this more cerebral, more sober focus on what exactly does this mean for us politically and socially going forward regarding the issue of civil rights. What would you say is kind of the big takeaway from this? It's not an either or decision about this narrative won out over that narrative, or this group won out completely over that group. Obviously, some people won more than others, but there were some strides made on both sides. So can you talk about that? How do we kind of pull back from this and say, okay, all of these different messages and groups, so how do we think of this era? How can we decide whether this was successful or not, a failure, an embarrassment? How do we make sense of it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think the best we can do is acknowledge that the legacy is mixed and complex. The Centennial played a really important role in boosting preservation in particularly in spurring the interest of private individuals in taking action to preserve battlefield lands that were under, grievous threat of development, particularly given Adams County did not have zoning regulations well into the 1970s. And for that reason, Gettysburg National Military Park wasn't able to, they weren't eligible for a lot of, for special funding for preservation from Congress during this era. And that's why the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association was founded. It was founded in 1959 to do through private funding and private action what didn't seem to be possible through public funding and public action. The Centennial gave us a landscape on that where the lost cause is far more prevalent than it had been prior to 1961. The Centennial gave us West Confederate Avenue, which dramatically changed the landscape of the park and the representation of the Confederate cause on the park landscape. Yet at the same time, the Centennial also gave us the beginnings of, or the resurgence perhaps, of a real emancipationist memory at Gettysburg, and the first occasions in which African Americans were invited into commemorative conversations, invited to play leading roles, invited to be speakers, invited to provide, their own perspectives on the commemoration. And that, as you say, that was almost, that demonstrated change and growth between July of 1963 and November of 1963. November of 1963 was not only more cerebral, more focused on foreign policy, more somber, it was also far more diverse in terms of the voices who were invited to speak and debate the meaning of the Gettysburg Address in the present, both for Americans and for people around the globe. I think I mentioned in the book that historians often talk about the final act of the Centennial being the very small scale commemoration at Appomattox, which was quite sedate. It was not the program that the planners had originally wanted at all. And that, I think, points to a lot of the failures and weaknesses of the Centennial. But if we think about the last program of the Centennial being the 1965 commemoration of the Gettysburg Address, we have a Black scholar at the helm of that commemoration. We have John Hope Franklin speaking in the National Cemetery and then speaking at Gettysburg College that evening on Lincoln and Reconstruction, and speaking openly about the challenges and complexities of trying to connect historical figures with contemporary events, and speaking directly to the attempt by some white hate groups to recruit Lincoln to their cause, to argue that Lincoln was a segregationist, to argue that Lincoln was a racist. And if we think about the fact that Gettysburg in 1965 was providing a stage for America's premier Black scholar to talk about Lincoln and his views on race, to talk about Reconstruction, a topic that got very little coverage during the Centennial. I think it helps us see that the legacies of the Gettysburg Centennial are so mixed and so complicated that we can't really answer that question of, was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Did it move, how far did it move the needle? Well, it moved the needle and it moved it back and it moved it and it moved it and it moved the needle out in so many different kinds of directions. The Gettysburg Centennial became, like I said earlier, a prism for talking about so many different issues of contemporary concern. And it certainly showed the flexibility of the Civil War past, the mutability of that past, the way that it could be interpreted and put to use for a wide range of purposes, which from a public history standpoint, is inherently fascinating and tells us a lot about the way that people make meaning of the past and use it to ground themselves in the present. It also, I think, from the point of view of a historian, it also raises a lot of really disturbing questions about how could a narrative be that mutable? Mm-hmm. How could this historical event be used to fuel so many different kinds of campaigns in the present? That's memory, that's heritage, that's not history. History, that's not what history is. So it's interesting. I think there was a lot less of that during the sesquicentennial. I think that the pasts that were created, the sesquicentennial, at least in my point of view, it was far more educational in tone. It was far more focused on broadening our understanding of the war, broadening the lens that we used to explore the war, bringing untold stories to the forefront, and magnifying voices that had been previously marginalized. I think there was much less emphasis on this idea of creating usable pasts that propel certain actions in the present. And I think there are both strengths and weaknesses to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea of the usable past, which obviously a lot of public historians go back to that term time and time again and looking for relevance. It shows the opportunities and the severe challenges for that, because the past can be used, obviously, but by whom and for what purposes is always the question. And when you have something as mutable as the Civil War, especially in times that are highly polarized, and we've seen it, just recently, as you conclude with your book, with the alt-right gathering in 2020 in the National Cemetery, and the fact that Gettysburg was used as a stage, or as a proposed stage, for both presidential candidates leading up to the 2020 election. It's still being used and misused and manipulated in all kinds of ways, which I think is a good reminder about the kaleidoscopic nature of memory and of history, and how there's a drastic difference between the two, but also about the challenges and opportunities of what constitutes a usable past. To wrap up, you quoted before he was elected president, President Biden, when he was here in Gettysburg, had talked about the battle for America's soul, and talking about how that was something that existed in Gettysburg. This was the battle for America's soul, and that going into the election of 2020, which I think a lot of people on both sides thought, this is the battle for America's soul. Yeah, I think people still come to Gettysburg, obviously, for all different reasons, but there is something about the battle for America's soul. What does it mean to be an American standing on the Gettysburg battlefield, and what can that experience standing there tell me about my individual place as an American, where I came from, where I need to go in the future, and where I think the country should go. I think that's a perfect summary of 1963 and the Centennial, is the battle for America's soul, and so many different voices and parties and interests went into it for all different kinds of reasons. And I should say too that we've seen the evolution, of course, as you talked about, even between July 1963 and November 1963, in terms of how issues of race and civil rights were talked about and even actively addressed in the incorporation of more diverse voices. We have to give credit to the Park Service, too, for its much more inclusive discussions of these monuments that you're talking about, and about memory and commemorations, that this battlefield isn't just one strict historical story, but it's layer upon layer of memory. And I know with their recent Wayside project that you've even worked on with students, in helping to contextualize these monuments and try to explain what did these inscriptions mean within the context of when they were carved into these monuments and when the monuments were erected. They've done a great job at diversifying their programming and including these stories about memory, and how people have used the battlefield and its memories in different ways. So
Absolutely.
it's exciting to see the two blend, the scholarship on it, but then actually living in Gettysburg, of course, and seeing on the ground the tours and the waysides and the interpretive programs that are being held, that are also addressing the complexity of what you talk about here. And honestly, Jill, I'm sure we could go on for hours and hours, because as I said, when I was preparing for this, I thought, oh my gosh, there are so many different complex issues. And everyone who's watching, you need to buy the book, Gettysburg 1963, hot off the press, because it delves so much more deeply into these issues that we could get even into tonight. And it also talks about these fascinating stories of logistics and even some comical quotes, which I really enjoyed, about the way businesses tried to pitch themselves to visitors in relationship to the Centennial and different advertisements.
I highly recommend that Centennial issue of the Gettysburg Times. Just reading the advertisements is fascinating. Someday I'm going to write an article just on that.
Oh, you should. You should. It sounded amazing. So yes, there's something for everyone in this book. Obviously, most of it is about the deeper subjects that we talked about, but there's also the important logistical conversations and how local residents and businesses sought to capitalize off of this and sought to make this commemoration meaningful and fruitful for themselves.
And one thing I didn't really mention, but going back to what we were talking about earlier on about Gettysburg being a local community made up of people who actually lived there. One element of this civil rights story that I didn't really address, but I do explore more in the book, is the way that the local Black population found opportunities to use this local concern about, we're going to be embarrassed on the world stage if there are demonstrations here, if there are protests, or, if heaven forbid a television camera sees an African-American family going into a restaurant and not being able to be seated. They knew exactly how to use that to advance, causes that they had been struggling over for years. Exactly how to use that to tie to their own deeply rooted campaigns to desegregate public accommodations and to provide, more equitable educational and employment opportunities. Right. So when we think about, the civil rights context, like, it's not just, Lyndon Johnson and, Sam Gibbons talking about how the world is going to become communist if Americans don't get their act together and stop sending police dogs out to bite children. It's also, local people saying, well, the eyes of the world will be watching, and wouldn't it be a shame if such and such happened? Well, what could we do to make sure that such and such doesn't happen by actually changing policies and practices, right here in our own businesses?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, Jill, to bring us back to Gettysburg as a place and not just an idea that can be used for different purposes. And one other thing I'll just quickly mention that we didn't get a chance to talk about was something that's no longer still extant, the Cyclorama building, and the use of that building as a display of American technology in the Cold War era, of how, again, that's going to place America as a global superpower. But the fact that it's the storage space and display space for this massive cyclorama depicting Pickett's Charge as the high water mark of the Confederacy, and being this place where diplomats and foreign leaders could theoretically come and engage issues talking about foreign policy and world peace with the backdrop of Pickett's Charge behind them. Again, very much a Cold War narrative. And I remember when I first heard you talk about that aspect of your book at a conference, I thought I had never even thought about that building as a monument before. But in fact, when you read everything in your book about how this was designed and the different elements that were designed to project these aspects of American industrial power and technological innovation, and then the backdrop for these international speakers and the different interpretive programming that was imagined. I mean, it's fascinating. And of course, that that structure is no longer there because part of Mission 66, which of course situating visitor centers right in the heart of the most historically significant parts of battlefields to make them accessible, which also took away from the preservation of the landscape and significantly hindered proper interpretation. So of course the cyclorama is no longer standing for that reason, because it was right in the center of the Union line. But that's another great thing, especially for people who might have been familiar with the cyclorama before it came down, to hear more about all of the work that went into this. And it's much more than this giant structure of concrete and cement, but that it meant a lot more. And for those of you who haven't seen it or who didn't get the chance to see it, you can definitely imagine it through Jill's book.
That was one of my favorite parts of the project, honestly, particularly as somebody who had once worked in that building. Yes. And knew how trying it was for the people who worked in it, and how complicated it was to maintain and make work, to see. And then, to have a front row seat to the debates over the demolition, living in Gettysburg at the time, it was fascinating to me to see the symbolic weight that was originally attached to that building, to see all that it was meant to represent, and how quickly that message got lost. And yet at the same time, how it endured as a permanent testimony to the influence of the Cold War on the interpretation of the Battle of Gettysburg, but nobody really knew that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that was fascinating. I mean, I never knew that story as well until I was reading your book. So thank you so much, Jill, for joining us tonight. And thank you to everyone who maybe caught the first part of the broadcast, and maybe there are people who will view this part later because you might have thought we were cut off for good. But thank you for your patience in coming back and joining us for part 2. We will have actually 2 December Finding the Sources. I believe they're back-to-back, 2 weeks back-to-back. Both the first Wednesday in December will feature Jim Downs, who is another member of the Gettysburg College faculty, teaches in the history department, talking about his new book, Maladies of Empire. And then the week afterwards, we'll be talking with Gordon Ray about his new book as well on the 1864 and 65 campaigns. So hopefully we'll see you with fewer technological issues in December. But for tonight, Jill, again, thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you.
I will likely see you in the office later this week.
Very likely, yes. Thank you, everybody.
You don't want to get that cold.
That's right.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Good night.